Misconfigured Firebases can expose users' data.
So Chris, sounds like you've got a story about Firebase, which I've heard is really helpful for creating new Android apps, but it's kind of the devil is in the details. What can you tell us?
Yes, so unfortunately, the vulnerability surrounding this Firebase database is a very common vulnerability, and that's a simple misconfiguration. A lot of these app developers were building their mobile apps and even web apps to use the Firebase backend database. However, they weren't securing it with any credentials or authentication or access tokens. So this was leaving this vulnerable to a lot of brute force attacks, because an attacker would just be able to query the project ID of the Firebase database, which is a global unique identifier. So these unauthenticated databases are vulnerable to simple REST API calls. As an attacker, you can brute force the project ID, which is a unique global identifier of the database, and you can take the domain firebaseio.com, which you can find easily on Google Firebase's documentation. And if you suffix that with a .json, you can query unauthenticated databases and steal a lot of user data, such as emails, usernames, location data, chat history, and private passwords.
Oh, that's really something.
So,
and I'm reading this article from Comparitech, and it sounds like they did a good amount of research into figuring out just how big this exposure was, and it seems to be sizable. But they also provide some good recommendations for people who are developers and ways to make sure this doesn't actually happen, which is good.
Yeah, so the security research firm found that about 4.8% of these mobile apps using Firebase were not properly secured, and that these apps were downloaded about 4 billion times. So there's a good chance if you're an Android user, you might have been, your user data might have been compromised. And Firebase is a pretty popular backend, so it's used for iOS, Android, and Node.js web apps.
From what I'm seeing here, they're not going to list the applications that were affected, specifically because they can't guarantee that the developers will ever take this data down, which is an interesting point. I mean, most of the time you think if somebody finds a problem, you share it with them and they're willing and listen, and they'll take it down quickly. But sometimes you just don't get a response when you do some sort of notification like that. And there's been situations like that where we've notified people of a problem and we've gotten either very little response or no response. And sometimes the problems didn't get fixed at all. So I kind of understand that. What do you think? What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, so Firebase, I guess it's GCP hosted, right? So it's a one of these PaaS, platform as a service, where you're responsible, right, for securing. And Chris, you went through all the different options you have, and we see this in other providers. Things like we've done a ton of stories on S3 buckets, right, and how they're you can a similar brute force enumerate S3 buckets. Did it say if the project ID is available via the app somehow? Right, are you able to kind of expose that, or is it more a brute force kind of traditional, just enumerate across the REST API?
They did mention in the article that some of these project IDs were searchable through the Bing search engine. So an attacker might just be able to do a quick search on these and find the project IDs, and just do a simple REST API call to grab this data.
Yeah, that certainly makes it easier, right? When you kind of know what that your URI is, right? That you can look up. But again, like you said, I'm sure there's more, right? If the ones that aren't exposed, if you had that URL, you just append what you said .json, and you can see what you hit.